Hi, I'm Ed Amorosa from Tag Cyber, and I'm here with my friend David Wolpoff, but everybody calls him Moose. So we're going to say Moose here for the video. And if you know Moose, then you know that yeah, he loves that moniker. So we're going to go by that. But he's the founder and CTO of a very cool company called Randori. Moose, welcome. And it's nice to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
That's great. And I love the backdrop and your video there. Tools are probably a good metaphor for what we're talking about. So that's great. Hey, Moose, before we get into kind of talking about you and your career and the company, just give a brief summary. What does Randori do? There might be some people who would like to just get a brief thumbnail on the company.
Sure, yeah. So Randori is it's an attack platform. So we built the same thing that you expect nation states or high-end criminal organizations to have. And our whole goal is just to be that trusted adversary, basically letting you have a hacker, right, a bad guy, that trusted adversary that you can interrogate, interact with, and help understand what your organization looks like from kind of the bad person's perspective. Hopefully you can leverage that perspective to improve your security program.
That is a really important capability for enterprise teams now. I'm so glad you guys are doing that. Now, I have this image that you probably were interested in this at a young age. Did you have a mischievous streak kind of growing up a little bit?
You know, actually, I'm probably one of the few hackers who didn't do too many stupid things in high school. I think, like everybody else, I just wanted to play video games. And, you know, for those folks who are old, like me, you'll remember that playing video games used to be really hard. You had to like tinker with all these settings in your computer just to get stuff to work. That's kind of
Right.
how I got into it. And then I actually built out a whole career starting out doing forensics. So I'm an electrical engineer by education. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to take apart electronics and get data out of them kind of in service of forensic missions. I actually worked in laboratories that looked not too unlike my home shop and a lot less like data centers. Kind of circa 2000, maybe the world transitioned. I don't know if you all have heard of this thing called the iPhone, but launched way back then and kind of changed the world of digital forensics, especially for those of us who work with mobile devices. And that kind of spawned this career for me in breaking into cell phones and then breaking into everything else. And then ultimately leading red teams breaking into corporations. It's kind of an unusual path to get there.
Well, but a good one. Now, when you were studying electrical engineering, was that kind of your first glimpse into really how hardware works and the inner workings and guts of, say, a device or a computer? Was that the beginning?
Yeah, for sure. I think, honestly, it was electrical engineering or math and physics was too hard. So the nice thing about being an electrical engineer was they still teach you how the silicon works. And so kind of my introduction to real, like nitty gritty computing started with, machines and how the machine functions and machine language. And I had to learn operating systems and networking much later in my career. But I think that was an easier pivot, I think, than for some folks who really learn the high level concepts and then are trying to figure out what's a machine doing under the hood.
Was the work you're doing in forensics, was that an employment kind of thing or an interest, or how'd you get into forensics?
Honestly, I just started out looking for anything that blended cryptography with embedded systems design. So I was basically paying the bills by teaching classes and by doing electronics design, try to put myself through college. And then I got a little bit bored in school with smelling soldering iron fumes and did my master's degree in information theory. So it's still technically electrical engineering, but
Wow.
just just all math and information. I studied a lot of cryptography. I kind of wanted to get out of the central states, and I took a gig working on the East Coast doing forensics for a defense contractor. So yeah, I got to do forensics as a professional career, and it was a good opportunity to really learn how everything works.
It's
Yeah,
funny when I worked at Bell Labs, I used to walk by this big portrait of Claude Shannon every morning. And when you play football and you tap the last football players their picture, we would walk in and tap the picture of Claude Shannon, hoping that
nice.
like it would waft in and make us smarter. Didn't work for me. The crypto stuff, that's probably been a useful background. I think as you do what you guys do now, it's probably useful to have some background in cryptography.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of folks, like myself included, maybe go into their careers thinking I'm going to be the one to figure out how to, factor composite numbers efficiently, and then realize that you're not that smart. But understanding really how these things work, and I think more importantly, how we kind of cleverly try to improve performance of various algorithms using, hardware and software solutions. It's been kind of an interesting boon in the career. Certainly, I like understanding how everything works, so being able to get to the metal and the math really helps.
That's really cool. Now, tell us a little bit about how you engaged with your co-founder and kind of the origins of Randori. I think that's an interesting story.
Yeah. So my experience by the time I got to meet Brian, so my co-founder Brian Hazard, was pretty much orthogonal to Brian. So Brian had spent his whole career doing defense application enforcement. He was an early employee over at Bit9 and then into Carbon Black. Whereas I'd spent my life kind of working in the defense space and then transitioning to this, thing that we called hacker on retainer, which is very high-end red teaming. So I actually had the fortune of being the guy whose team got hired to break into Carbon Black. So I think the first time I sat down to dinner with Brian Hazard, we were kind of talking about ideas for how to maybe get the next company or the next big thing. I got introduced to Brian and I said, "Wait, are you BK Hazard? Is your password?" And then that out because I hacked through, and of course the stupid things that my hacker brain remembers are like random beverages people really like, or what their musical instrument was in middle school, or what your password happens to be 4 years ago. Uh, so yeah, it
Well,
was an interesting introduction.
BK Hazard is an awesome name. That almost sounds good enough to be like a made up name. That's way too good, right?
Well, Brian is definitely a hazard. Uh, so it's been an interesting journey, getting the two of us working
How
together.
did you guys parlay that into the partnership and into the company?
Yeah, I mean, so the company I was working for at the time actually was the company that had spun out Carbon Black that had merged with Bit9. So we had a lot of common
Yeah.
paths. Maybe half the people that I'd worked with professionally before were in some way in this kind of, Carbon Black circle of success, as it were. Brian was looking for his next opportunity, getting ready to basically move on after 13, 14 years at Bit9. I was kind of beginning to look for my next thing. And really, some of the kind of family members of that Carbon Black Iris world just put us together at dinner at some point, and it was kind of just an easy connection from there. We started iterating. A lot of folks were exploring what would be named the Abaz market at the time, and we kind of looked at that,
Yeah.
realized that it wasn't quite a fit for how we thought the industry needed to progress, and I think a couple of beers and some ideation later, we popped out with this idea for Randori. So it's been a wild ride.
What year was that, Merce?
Yeah, so I think we sat down to dinner in the fall of 2017. We officially kicked off Randori in the early 2018. So are coming up on 3 years here pretty soon. So it's been fun. It's been a lot of work. But
Well, I've been
startup.
impressed. I found out about what you guys were doing early and thought it was a good idea. Why don't you share a little bit about the platform? How, if somebody's thinking of buying, how's it work? What's the value prop?
Yeah. So what we've really been trying to do is just automate everything that I would have done or my team would have done as a red teamer, and really enable a platform to deliver a red team experience. So if I look at my professional career, breaking into these really complex, very sophisticated organizations, there are all these tremendous learnings that people got from basically being able to put their blue teamers in the same room as the person who'd hacked them and just let them have a conversation, right? Now there's a lot of buzz around this kind of purple team exercise idea.
Yeah.
But I think realistically, all you need to do is you need to practice using your tools. You need to plan your defenses without being firmly rooted in your assumptions. You need to let somebody be able to come at you in an authentic way to kind of check assumptions and then just be able to learn, lather, rinse, repeat, improve what you're doing. But the cost of bringing in a red team, particularly a high-end red team, and engaging with them for a long period of time is just so expensive that it's just not attainable for a lot of folks. So the kind of core thesis for us is that we can automate the heck out of most of that process. And there's very little like actual human innovation that has to happen in order to deliver a real red team or a hacker experience at scale. So what we're doing with Randori is that, right? It's black box reconnaissance, find all the stuff, all the people that make up an organization, use that as a mechanism for dialogue between two parties, red and blue, and then let the red team come at the blue team and try to break in with authentic attacks in a kind of unscripted, realistic environment, and then let folks unwind what happened and understand, and then lather, rinse, repeat, try to level up the defense.
I'm trying to anticipate some thoughts that people watching might have. Like a lot of people understand intuitively how like how brute force attacks work in automation,
Sure.
right? You would never do that manually. It'd be dumb, right? You write some software and boom, you let it run.
Sure.
Is that a little window into the idea here, or is it more heuristic? Like, or is it like this big expert conditional, almost like pre-AI? Like, wow, did it do this? Okay, then do this. Wow, did it do that? Like, what's how would you help somebody sort of motivate an understanding of what's behind the automation?
Yeah, I think the typical confusion that I get is people think that if we're automating a hacker, we must be automating the process of finding every vulnerability,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And there's some of that, right? Certainly, if I'm trying to enumerate the places that you have a particular software and I know about a vulnerability in software, then yeah, I'm finding instances of bugs for people.
Mm.
But the more interesting question to me is, kind of the whole experience. If we find something in your environment that is unpatched, right, or is misconfigured, you probably have some sort of process failure. If we're able to leverage an attack that you didn't know about, or we can beat you to an end day capability. So, a great example. If I had weaponized a bug in Windows domain controllers on the first day that Microsoft published it, and then it took you 2 weeks to get all of your systems patched, right? I, as an attacker, could have pressed the attack further in your environment. So we tend to focus less on specific vulnerabilities, and we tend to focus more on the sequence of activities that a hacker might do. So we're totally plumbing a lot of very sophisticated logic, right? We're trying to say if we find this software and this circumstance exists, then use this exploit,
Mhm.
or then lay down this implant. But behind the scenes, we've got this team of people in our hacker operations center who are kind of looking across all of the customer environments, and they're able to plan out a campaign. It's the same thing that real adversaries do. So if they come up with some clever technique, or some other hacker comes up with a clever technique and is published in the news, or Microsoft publishes a bug, we'll try to implement that once as a runbook. So whatever the technique might be, and then the system can go find all of the places that that runbook's going to apply across all of our customers, and then deliver that instantaneously. Well, maybe not instantaneously, but pretty quick. So the objective becomes for us to be able to go from one-on-one red team engagements to one-to-many red team engagements by automating anything that can be automated. And then ultimately, if I can find some brilliant AI specialists to figure out how to automate finding and weaponizing a vulnerability, that sounds great. But the meta thread for me is really find the software, find the people, figure out good, clever ways to leverage that knowledge into some sort of attack progression, and then let people learn from an experience.
Yeah. Bruce, one of the things, like if, let's say you and I were the security guys at a bank somewhere and we're trying to deal with this general area. Here's the challenge we have, and I'm interested in your thoughts. One, you can hire pen testers, and you and I, and we all know a lot of pen testers, and there's good and bad ones. If you get a good one, it's good, it's awesome. You can do the Baz thing, like you mentioned earlier, these continuous attack simulation tools, usually pumped up with the MITRE attack framework or something, and they're running all these things. A third is you can do crowdsource, like a bug bounty kind of thing, and it goes on and on and on and on. What's your? Because I love what you guys are doing. I'm trying to think, if you're in an enterprise security role, how do I make sense of all this? And when I call you guys, are you yet another category, or do you unify some of these things? How do you guys explain that to somebody? I hope that's a reasonable question.
Yeah, it's a very reasonable question. There's a lot there. I'll try to keep it all in my
Yeah.
head long enough to answer it all. I think if I think about Baz first, breach and attack simulation, most of the kind of plays that I've seen there are really about checking that the piece of technology you deployed is working in the way that you intended it to be working, right? So, I have a sensor in a particular place, or I have a control in a particular place, and I'm going to replay some known bad across that sensor and make sure that I get the signal I want to get. That's value, to be sure, but I don't think that a lot of folks who are looking to simulate an attack are going to get that from a Baz deployment, right? Because the concept is that you're starting with the assumption that your defenses are in the right place, and then you're confirming that they're working as you expect. My career as a red teamer, very rarely stepped on a defense when I knew it was there, and quite often failed to step on a defense that I didn't know was there, right?
Yeah.
So checking those assumptions, I think, is kind of one of the first pieces. I think if you look at stuff like the bug bounty or the crowdsourced vulnerability assessment, that's a really good way to, one, engage with the community and get people to report stuff that you might not
Right.
otherwise know about.
Yeah.
It's also a great way to get people looking at a specific application that you built or that's yours and is really unique to you, right? Because if you have something that only exists in your environment, you can't really get that thing assessed without having somebody look specifically at that thing, right? Problem is that you often don't have a way to leverage that knowledge to find out if it really mattered, right? If you have a
Mm.
vulnerability in your perimeter, and somebody reports that vulnerability, that's great, but you probably have a security program behind that that's supposed to, I don't know, detect a compromise after it's occurred, right? Or respond to a thing that's maybe a couple stages deep. We all know that you're going to get breached or you're going to get compromised somewhere, right? And we're
Right.
trying to stop it from turning into a breach. So if you only ever exercise the patching and discovery part of that, you're never exercising the, what next. Um, I think, and that's where like the pen test red team thing, the problem with that space has really been it's been a race to the bottom, right? As compliance became a bigger driver, you have people who are trying to check the box more than derive deep value, and prices come down, services come down. I think for those of us who are really old, we remember when pen testing was kind of the phrase for really high end activities, and then it kind of transitioned to a more commoditized. We need the report quickly, 2 weeks, do what you got to do. Red teaming kind of turned into this thing. I think we're seeing the same trend. I think the objective for me is just to let folks have an adversary that's always there so that you can be not just testing that you can find and fix stuff quickly, but also that when opportunity arises for an adversary to do something, that you have an adversary in place who can capitalize on that event and then be able to check the rest of the process that you've got.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious how are enterprise teams responding? What any particular sector, or is it? This sounds like the kind of thing almost anybody would be interested in, but I'm curious what your experience has been with customers.
Yeah, so when we went through the exercise of trying to slice and dice markets and verticals and decide who we're going to go after, I guess do all that business stuff that people
Right,
care about for some
right.
reason. Um, it was actually a problem that any individual traditional business vertical wasn't always a good fit, and so we started looking for different characteristics in customers who
Hmm.
could help us kind of hone the offering. I'll say that the place that I see the most value being delivered for our attack offerings for customers is really in the place or businesses where they have some sort of threat hunt or active blue team capacity as like a human in the loop, trying to improve their defenses. And we see a lot of our customers really leveraging the platform to help them test and assess whether the people and the process works more than just trying to find individual vulnerabilities. We also have a whole cohort of folks using just our reconnaissance components, right? And they're actually, I would say, somewhat less mature most of the time, and they're really leveraging an adversary to bring a different perspective to how they're thinking about prioritization and risk management. So as we've had this kind of transition to risk, even people who aren't prepared to have a red team or come at them and beat them up can put themselves in that, from in that lens of the adversary and say, oh, a hacker's looking at us in this way. Maybe these things are higher risk for me, right? Or maybe I need to think about how the impact of a particular scenario is going to, or how a particular scenario is going to impact my business in a different way.
That is interesting. So I would have guessed that right off the bat that it was skewed more toward perhaps larger companies, but I guess you're right. Like with the recon, probably more reasonable and easier to deploy. Hey, as you look out into the future, what are some things you see coming? Do you see automation in particular becoming just a routinely assumed part of red teaming? It hasn't been in the past. Do you think as we move forward, it would be as dumb to talk about this without automation as it would be to like talk about DevOps without automation? Is that where we're headed?
Yeah, I think the change in the pace of development of technology is kind of a big driver, right? So as we've seen this transition to cloud, we've seen a transition to like call it the modern DevOps world, right? People are working from home. The way in which we do business is changing. The way in which we do technology is changing along with it. Um, cybersecurity. We've been talking about risk management, academically for a very long time. You know, I remember papers that go back to the really early 2000s. We really haven't seen any motion in that space until very recently. And so I think the thing that I'm excited about the most is that as businesses are beginning to look at getting hacked as a thing that's somewhat inevitable in the same way they're looking at any other form of loss or disruption to business as inevitable, they've changed how they're thinking about it from find and fix and remove vulnerability to let's manage our risk and keep the business functioning. That changes how you have to think about the processes and tools. And as you're looking at trying to perform anything that's assessing your security in a risk managed world instead of a risk elimination world, you can't look at a snapshot in time anymore. You can't look at a 2-week pen test and think that you're good, or a red team assessment and think that you're at the right level. Everything's transitioning to continuous. Everything's transitioning to automated. And anything that can be automated will be. It's just a matter of how we integrate that into our flows and help our teams get better.
That's awesome. Hey, you enjoying running the company and working with customers? It's been a fun ride.
It's startup life. It is wildly exciting. It is incredibly stressful. It is a lot of work. Everybody tells you up front that being a founder at a company is a lot of work, but they don't understand it for you,
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing. You really do describe the technology very clearly. That's a big asset, being able to describe this in a way that people can understand. So I do appreciate it. We all appreciate the work, Moose, that you guys do. You and Brian, keep up the good work. We're looking for great things from you guys, and I really do think you've changed the equation a little bit on the way this work proceeds and how it helps enterprise teams. So once again, on behalf of everybody watching and our team at Tag Cyber, thanks for sharing. Really enjoyed learning from you today, Moose.
Hey, I appreciate the time. Thanks for having me.
Great. Keep up the good work. And we will see you all next time.